Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edwin Coates. I'm CEO and founder of Solarplaza. Welcome to this webinar, Curtailment and Negative Electricity Pricing Trends. We have a couple of very interesting keynote speakers here to join us today. Let's move on quickly to learn a little bit more about the event and the Solarplaza background. Let me see if we can bring up the next slide. Yep, so that's me, Edwin, introducing you quickly. The speakers, Sylvain Cognet-Dauphin, Jean-Paul Harreman, and Gerard Reid. And then we have a Q&A session at the end. A little bit about Solarplaza, a company I founded in 2004. We have done more than 230 events across the world and a global network. It's all about sharing knowledge and network. That's what we're doing as well today. This event is this webinar is a run-up to our and part of our campaign towards an event that's going to discuss more extensively the negative prices, the curtailment, and what's influencing the electricity price. That event is taking place on the 27th of November in Amsterdam. High-level strategy summit discussing the future of the electricity price for the next decade. And suppose you have to take decisions about your investments in renewable energy, specifically solar or wind, and that forecast or that expectation of the electricity price in the next decade is, of course, crucial to your business models. And that's what we're going to discuss with a lot of experts from all angles looking at the electricity price. 50% discount, that code is available here. You can make a note, or at the end of the show, we will also show the discount again, and so you can benefit from a more conveniently priced access to that wonderful event. Practical notes. During the webinar, you can post questions. I have a team here, Sid and Tom, helping me out. If there's questions, they will show at our screen, and we can moderate. I will moderate, and we'll bring up the best and the most interesting questions, if possible, all questions, but we never know, because we have a lot of attendees, and there will be possibly a lot of questions. So we can discuss with the keynote speakers your questions. If you have any technical issues, there is a chat box on the right side in the menu, so you can also send in some questions. My colleagues are here to help you out. And the presentation slides and full recordings will be made available after the event. You will receive an email with instructions. Good, then, first speaker, let's go to the topic. Let's dive into the world of negative electricity prices and curtailment with the first speaker, Sylvain Cognet-Dauphin. If I pronounce it very well, it's a French accent. I try to imitate here. He is executive director at S&P, and he joined in S&P many years ago. He is an expert in the field. You can read all his CV on the screen. He has a master's degree from the École des Mines in Paris. And Sylvain is going to take us through some of his vision and experiences with the negative pricing. So Sylvain, if you can join, are you there?
Just arrived, and thank you, Edwin, for the very kind introduction, and looking forward to talking about pricing in Europe. Very exciting and timely topic.
The floor is yours, the screen is yours, you can take it away.
Good. So today I want to talk about a few things. Let me try to move the slides. Doesn't seem to be. There we are. So I want to talk about price trends and asset economics, because as Edwin said, we're going to talk during this event about power prices, and there are a lot of very interesting trends developing, and these trends actually have far-reaching implications both for operators of power plants, on new investors, but also on consumers. And if you take it down the stretch, also has a lot of impact on regulators and governments. To start with, perhaps the first thing that we need to keep in mind nonetheless is that the crisis is more or less over, one could argue, in terms of where we stand regarding prices in Europe. And it's just, I wanted to remind everybody of the current situation. So we had prices, around 30, 50 euro per megawatt hour till, I would say, early 2021. And we obviously went through a massive energy crisis that really shook Europe from mid-2022 till early 2023. For the past 12 months, we've been in a kind of situation in which prices have declined. They remain significantly, basically lower than during the crisis, but they are still a bit higher than pre-COVID levels. So we're into that world of basically fairly stable prices for about 12 months. But perhaps what's more interesting to look at is really looking beyond the annual or the monthly average price and thinking about price shape. When we think about price shape, the main thing that we wanted to highlight, and this is really something that Edwin mentioned to start the discussion with today, is just basically the distribution of prices has changed significantly. Baseload price is one story, but the main important story is rather the story of low price hours that has been emerging in Europe. Clearly, in 2024, we've been observing a record number of negative prices, and what we're charting here is day-ahead price distribution. And we're showing that basically here in Germany and in Spain, what we've been observing in 2024 is a significant increase in low price hours. What we've been also observing is significant increase in price between 0 and 10 euro per megawatt hour, which are also critical. And why do we think this is critical? Because when the price is negative, obviously it means that power producers have to pay to generate. And in some cases, that really has significant implications on the ability to recover cost. For instance, the fixed O&M of power plants, the O&M of power plant in general, about 10 to 20 euro per megawatt hour. So if the price is below 20 euro per megawatt hour, if you're a renewable asset operator, clearly, in a way, you're producing at a net cost. The price doesn't have to be negative for a utility, for an asset operator who doesn't benefit from subsidies to actually face challenging conditions. The other things that I wanted to highlight from that picture is that Germany and Spain, these are some of the front runners regarding renewable penetration, and other markets are less affected, like Italy, as you can see on the right. The reason really has to do with the level of renewable penetration, because renewable penetration is very much related to that story, to that emerging trend of negative and low price hours. And this has to do with some of the other concepts that we think are extremely relevant for power transformation. It has to do with capture rate. What is a capture rate? First, to start with. So a capture rate is the ratio between a generation weighted price for a given technology and the baseload price. Why is it a critical indicator? It's important because when you think about PV assets or wind assets, these are assets that tend to generate more or less at the same time, meaning that when they generate, they create a surplus of electricity, and that drives the price down, meaning that the average price that they receive basically is depressed by that kind of surplus factor, which is called cannibalization. A way to illustrate that is to look at the capture rate, which is that ratio between the price that they capture and the baseload price. What we've been observing, and you can see that from solar capture rates on the left, is that capture rate of solar PV in Spain, Germany has really been decreasing massively. And this has to do with basically the fact that with increasing solar penetration, basically the value in the wholesale market has declined. Italy, once more, is a bit of the element that stands out, the country that stands out, really because it has a lot less solar penetration in its market. Solar is shown on the left, wind is shown on the right. Right is interesting as well, because going back to the question of cannibalization, I mean, what's noteworthy in Europe is that perhaps they had more difficulties to grow the wind fleet, and we've seen less cannibalization as well across the market. Clearly, capture rates are doing a bit better, and this is because there's less cannibalization. Nonetheless, there is a slight declining trend. So what's important really is these two factors. We have more low price hours, we have declining prices, we have lower capture rate. Overall, that leads to significant challenges for renewable operators. Sorry, one slide too far. There we are. So we see that challenge for renewable assets, but at the same time, another element which is hidden in the price formation has to do with basically day-ahead spreads. And when we think about electricity markets and renewables, obviously we all know that there are some hours, as mentioned, in which there's going to be surplus electricity, and there's going to be some hours in which there's a lack, or in which you could argue, or there's just a lower penetration of renewable electricity. And what we've been observing is really massive price swings between low price hours and high price hours. A way to represent that is the day-ahead spread. The day-ahead spread, in a way, is the difference between the maximum price in a day and the minimum price in a day. Why is that a relevant indicator? It's interesting because if you're a battery, this is exactly the kind of monetization you're trying to do. You're trying to buy electricity when it is cheap, so the minimum price of the day, and you try to sell it when it's expensive, so the maximum price of the day. So in a way, that day-ahead spread, which is an indicator of volatility in the price, is also a very strong signal in order to basically trigger investment in batteries. And this is also for us a very interesting factor. Is at the same time as we've seen an increase in low price hours and in price volatility driven by renewables, we see that the market is signaling the need for flexibility to try to compensate for some of these low price hours and effect on the market. So really, it's very interesting to think about what's been taking place. Obviously, there's been the crisis, but following the crisis, there are a number of key lessons that we think are extremely interesting for the electricity market. Some of these lessons are basically several-fold. Some of these lessons are essentially that if you're an asset operator as of today, if you want to basically maintain some revenues, it's important to think about basically going beyond the wholesale market. You need to think beyond the electricity price that I've shown. You need to think about PPA prices that may be at a different level. You may be thinking about guarantees of origin that can support with the wholesale economics. It's important to think in mind as well in terms of the role of consumers. As mentioned, we see consumers investing in renewables via PPAs. Another interesting thing that consumers could do is that if they want to decrease their bills, which is still very much on everybody's to-do list, a very important thing is perhaps to think about consuming more and allocating shifting demand when prices are lower. This can be done by putting batteries on your rooftops, or this can be done by changing how the processes work. So there is something here to also incentivize a bit more consumer participation in the market. The factor, nonetheless, that we want to say about that volatility in the market is that essentially it is a feature for us which is here to stay. It is here to stay because we need basically that volatility to trigger investments in renewable assets. So do we think that batteries will solve in a way that situation about low price hours? No, we think that volatility is here to stay. That volatility will increase. It will be partly offset by basically batteries, but it is going to remain there. Another thing that we want to make sure is that this is based in the current market, which as of today. But what we see as well is that regulators are starting to take note of these low price hours. And for instance, a few years ago, the European Commission had said that we need to change the way we support renewables to avoid these low price hours. And we think that clearly regulators are also starting to look back at the situation. After the crisis, in a way, they are kind of looking back at the impact of renewables in the market. So it's likely that the market design will keep evolving because every day we uncover new challenges, and regulation and markets need to address these challenges. That means that in the future, we may also see changes in how assets can be monetized in the market because market rules will evolve. Finally, nonetheless, the last thing that I wanted to share is that we think is that this kind of current situation of volatile prices where new assets come in the market and so on, this means a lot more complexity for operators and consumers, and this is driving costs up. A key point we'd like to make is perhaps not all players can handle this complexity. And clearly, players that don't want to basically think about risks and so on, perhaps they should reconsider their positioning in the electricity market. On the other hand, complexity is also an opportunity to create new services in order to solve the challenge of basically price volatility, renewable penetration, and overall trying to bring forward the energy transition.
All right, Sylvain, that I assume was the last slide you had. Thank you very much. Very interesting start of this webinar. If there's any question from the audience, feel free to drop a question through the chat box in the webinar tool. Question from my side, Sylvain, in the meantime. So you pictured and you put these nice graphs for up till 2024, but just take it ahead like 3 years from now. Where we will see in all those markets that you discussed, like Spain and Germany and Italy, there will be a huge build out of more renewables. So how is this gonna, what is this gonna lead?
For us, it means, as I mentioned quickly, it means that volatility is here to stay. In our projections, and I guess we'll talk about projections and different outlooks during our event in Amsterdam in late November, but I think for us, it's a story of more volatility to come. It's a story of more low price hours. It's a story of basically more incentives for batteries. Batteries will eventually come in the market, but perhaps the revenues that I'm showing are insufficient. So it is a story of thinking about new business models, new way to monetize assets, but volatility is a feature, and we need to keep that in mind.
Okay, good. Let's go to the next speaker. Let me introduce you to him. He is Jean-Paul Harreman. working at Montel Analytics, an expert in the area, I would say. Welcome, Jean-Paul. We can see you now.
Thank you.
Yeah, director at Montel Analytics, an expert, I said. For sure, he's worked in the market since 2001, several analytical and management roles. We had him at one of our events last year. Very insightful presentation. I'm not going to talk too much. Jean-Paul, the floor is and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, let's move to the next slide. Let's see if I can make that work. Yes. So negative prices or not so negative prices. Sylvain's already flagged the issue of negative prices, and yeah, we've been speaking about this a lot. I think if you follow energy experts on social media like LinkedIn, you'll have seen quite a few of them dive into the subject. So I'll just give you a quick summary of what we've seen so far. So what I'll be showing you is the evolution of negative prices, something about hidden negative prices. So Italy was already mentioned. And then also other effects of the massive renewables build, and Sylvain mentioned the case for energy storage. There's a few other aspects that are quite important for that business case as well. So let's see where we are now. So we are now in 2024, and negative prices have been around for quite a while. You can see that since 2015, but even before 2015, yeah, we've seen several markets have hours and hours of negative prices over time. But yeah, the real takeoff for negative prices was obviously during COVID. You can see in the beginning of 2020. The cumulative lines for Ireland and Germany increasing quite a lot, with a lot of negative prices happening in those markets. So if we look at what this correlates with, let's see how I click. Here we go. So, oh, that was a bit too fast. I apologize, I'm on a quite slow Wi-Fi connection. Let's go back one. There we go. So if you look at the amount of negative prices in markets, you can basically see there's quite a strong correlation with European solar generation increases, except for 2021, 2022, when we didn't see many negative prices due to the gas crisis. So their energy prices were just much higher to start with. So yeah, to get from 300 euros to negative takes a bit more than to get from a normal price to negative prices. Current state of affairs, the gray line is Finland. Finland has the highest number of negative prices in Europe so far this year. Moving on to the next slide, hopefully. Let's see if that works. Right. So in 2024, we can see Finland is the country which sees by far the highest negative prices, highest number of negative prices. Why is that? Because Finland has two characteristics that are important to get to negative prices. One is a large amount of stable baseload generation that doesn't modulate, and yeah, relatively high amount of renewable power installed. So Finland only started seeing negative prices when the latest Olkiluoto 3 nuclear power plant went live, and that was 2 years ago. So you can see basically the orange line pointing straight up from yeah, must run renewables, must run conventional, nuclear generation, and that's just increasing those prices. Next in line in the ranking are Nordic regions like Sweden, and Norway used to be quite high as well. It's not this year because it doesn't have as much surplus generation as it had in the previous year. But Sweden is very similar to Finland, also has a large base load of nuclear, a lot of hydro, a lot of river hydro, and it's been quite a wet year, so that's why Finland, with all its different regions, is seeing more negative prices as well. And then we have Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, so very closely connected, and they all have a very high build out of solar. What's interesting is that you can see very large differences in prices during those hours of negative prices. So in red, you see the countries with the worst or the deepest negative prices, and those are generally driven by solar and yeah, a shortage of flexible power during the solar peak. So in Belgium, you have a large base load of nuclear. Then when the sun shines, it just pushes all of the flexible conventional generation out of the merit order, and that means that the price goes negative because anything that's non-dispatchable cannot be switched off anymore, and therefore yeah, you get into a surplus or excess situation. Similar things happen in Czech Republic, Hungary, Croatia, and the deepest negative prices we see in the Netherlands, which currently has about 23.9 gigawatts of installed capacity versus an average demand of around 15 gigawatts. So it's a bit out of balance, and that's where you see yeah, the surplus basically resulting in those deeper negative prices. Then in the blue areas, you can see a lot less extreme negative prices, and that's because yeah, the alternative revenue that you can generate with the power is driven by guarantees of origin. So if you get €2 per megawatt for a megawatt hour for a guarantee of origin, then the value of that guarantee of origin is basically the value of your power that you can sell below zero. In other countries, this is compensated by providing reserves to the power grid, and there these negative prices are driven by yeah, the lack of conventional generation. So it's a completely different story. And then another kind of quirky highlight to show is the difference between regions in Scandinavia. So NO2 and SE4 are regions that are in the south of Scandinavia, and what you're seeing there is the impact of interconnectors with mainland Europe, but also the fact that there's solar generation being installed in those regions, and that means that those prices go deeper below zero than in the north of Scandinavia, where the value of negative prices is only driven by guarantees of origin. So it's quite interesting phenomenon. So, and yeah, markets are coupled. Yeah, more and more integrated markets also lead to the import and export of negative prices. So on the map, it looks like this. So you can see basically the darker colors show you the areas that are seeing the highest number of negative prices, and you can see they are sort of in a band from the northeast to the southwest. Yeah, Nordics, very wet, low flexibility means there's a high must-run generation. There's nuclear in Spain, France, Sweden, Finland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. So that's why those markets yeah, have less flexibility, no dispatching down because of those negative prices, and that's where yeah, this high number of negative prices comes from. Italy, you see at zeros for all regions in Italy. Interesting thing there is that the Italian law doesn't allow for negative prices at all. So the lowest price you can see in Italy is zero. This will change on the 1st of January next year. So there's a big market reform in Italy coming. And in the next slides, I'll show you that we will see negative prices in Italy as well. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Hidden negative prices. So yeah, prices at zero are not negative, but actually, as Sylvain showed, if you divide the prices we see in the market into price buckets, you can see quite a dramatic difference between yeah, what you see as negative and very low prices. So in the ranking of seeing prices at zero or negative, Spain is actually the leader of the pack. And that's because, yeah, there are quite effective mechanisms to manage the oversupply of solar and wind in countries like France, Spain, Portugal, and also Italy. It has to do with the way the subsidies are allocated, and basically, if you get zero or a negative price, then you don't get a subsidy. So there's no real incentive to sell below zero if you can switch off your asset. So yeah, 774 hours of negative prices in Spain. Sorry, zero prices or lower in Spain. That is over 10% this year. So that's quite significant. One thing you'll also see is Sicily, 247 hours of zero prices. That is pointing towards a very large excess of solar that is not being transported away from the region. So yeah, from 2025, this might well turn into a region that sees quite a large number of negative prices. What we're seeing in practice is that renewable assets are no longer bidding into the energy market at any price. So we are actually seeing, for example, in France, up to 3 gigawatts of solar curtailment already in the day-ahead market. So people are just bidding it in at a price of zero. If the price goes below zero, you see this massive curtailment of solar up to 3 gigawatts. So yeah, that's a lot of power that is just turned off. And this has a few implications. So on the one hand, if you look at what's happening in the market in real time, weather models are no longer sufficient to forecast solar and wind generation, because these are commercial actions. So people just make a decision, I'm not going to sell below this price, and that means that they don't generate. And then obviously during the day, you will also see people just switching off because the prices on the power exchanges go negative. So it becomes a quite complex way of optimizing your renewables, which will very likely also feed into to PPA contracts, which will definitely have to account for commercial curtailment, because somebody will be responsible for the balancing risk of these actions. But there's also an impact on profile premiums and cannibalization, which is not unimportant, I would say. Moving on. So, but yeah, we're not only seeing a lot of negative prices, we're also seeing another effect, which is quite interesting. So the evolution of spreads has already been mentioned before. We don't like looking at spreads on an annual basis, because what we see is there's a lot of seasonality in volatility, the need for flexibility, and the way renewables and conventional power interact. So if we're looking at solar peak prices, so those prices are definitely dropping, and that's due to cannibalization, and it's a very important factor in the long-term outlook for renewable revenues. On the other hand, we also see higher evening and morning peak prices, and this is an interesting side effect. So what is happening is that during the solar peak, conventional power is being pushed out of the merit order by solar and wind. But actually, for the evening peak, this power is needed. But if you have a CCGT, so a gas power plant, you will actually have to sell your power in the day-ahead market. If you do that, and you can only run for the evening peak because during the afternoon the prices are negative, that means that you have to start it up from cold, which is less efficient, takes more gas, is more costly to run, and therefore we're seeing higher evening peak prices, especially in the weekends. But higher evening peak prices are a feature of this renewables dominated market, and that is basically the other side of the coin. So there's always something going. If something goes down, something else has to come up, because otherwise people go bankrupt. And this sort of has an impact both on capture prices. So because the capture prices or the prices in the evening go higher, whereas when solar is generating, the prices go lower. So this delta becomes a double-edged sword. So it's going up in the evening when there's no solar, it's going down when there is solar, and on the compound effect of this is that your capture rate for solar drops more quickly than wind, which sort of produces more randomly. So periods of high and low prices are also getting longer, and that means that you see these spreads increasing, as Sylvain already pointed out, on an annual basis. But there's also very strong seasonal patterns in price spreads, because price spreads are not just driven by renewables, but also by conventional power. In the winter, there's more conventional power needed, which means there's more flexibility in the grid, which means you see less extreme prices, especially in the evening peak. So yeah, this all impacts not just the renewable case, but also the case for storage. Right. Now, well, we're at the subject, the case for storage. So during the summer, we have a very, very good case. So solar peaks result in curtailment and negative prices. So if you can capture those volumes of megawatt hours and save them for the evening peak, which has a relatively high price due to the start costs and the lower run hours of conventional power, then you have a pretty good business case. Also, if you have a storage asset, you can actually participate in ancillary services, and ancillary services have both an energy payment for the activation of your reserves, but also a capacity payment, so an availability fee. And those availability fees go up as there's less conventional power online. So this is a very nice a nice business case, especially for short duration storage. Short duration, I'm saying up to 4 hours of storage. We see quite a lot of battery projects getting financed in the Benelux, but also in Germany and in the UK. So our consultancy team works quite hard on those kinds of projects. The problem, however, is that during winter, the business case is a lot less attractive. So every February, I get a call from some of our battery customers and saying, well, we've had a few months of very low spreads. The competition is stronger because there's more spinning reserve online. Is this going to be okay for summer? And every year I tell them the same thing. I mean, it's winter. This is logical. The market is just worse for storage now. And what you'll see is that lower spreads, more spinning reserve, lower availability fees for ancillary services. And battery storage is just less suited to shift longer periods of access. And in the winter, that's mostly wind. And then you basically need other forms of storage that can either consume power for a longer period and then feed them back. So on traditional markets, you have relatively low revenues for short duration storage in the winter. There are obviously solutions and business cases, and I would urge people not to talk about subsidies, because that is very disrupting for the market. And if an asset is not profitable without a subsidy, then basically we're digging a hole for ourselves. But that is sort of the short story. So it's negative prices have side effects, and they are very pronounced in different markets and often overlooked.
All right, Jean-Paul, thank you very much. Very insightful information again, like the previous speaker. I was triggered already by when Sylvain discussed the term of low price hours instead of negative price hours, and then you clearly explained that maybe in the Netherlands we have a lot of negative hour prices, but in Spain you have low energy price hours, which is probably more relevant because imagine like in Spain they're going to build 50 more gigawatts of solar according to the plan. If you have a plant running on 1,000 hours of almost zero, it's probably also not a business case, despite the fact that there is not so many negative hours. So
correct.
How do you
we're seeing a lot of parties investigating the combination of solar and storage, because the solar peak is a nice duration compared to the affordable storage solutions that are in the market. So that is something we see a lot of interest in.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have more questions, and there's some questions coming in. Keep sending them in. Good, we'll save them for the Q&A after the next speaker, which I'm going to introduce right now. His name is Gerard Reid. He's a well-known influencer on LinkedIn. Actually, he's been on the broadcast at the TEDx presentation, going to be released very soon, if I'm correct. Gerard, welcome. He's a co-founder and partner of Alexa Capital. He is a co-host of the visited listened podcast, Redefining Energy. A lot of visitors, a lot of people following that. Gerard, welcome. I'm not going to do a lot more talking. I leave the talking to the expert like you. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Edwin. It's good to be here. So let me just give you a little bit of a different view. Now, by the way, I'm not sure if it works. So let me just sort of go back to August. What we saw was power prices across the whole continent negative, right? And obviously, if you look every weekend, what we're seeing is negative prices everywhere. Now, what does negative prices mean, and what should we do, and why are they negative? Well, I think we have to go back to a little bit of physics, which is at the end of the day, we have to keep the power system at around the 50 hertz level. And the grid operator has been doing this for 100 years. So either what you're doing is you're bringing more power into the system, or you're bringing more demand into the system, or you're doing the opposite, right? But you do this all the time, and it's been done by grid operators for hundreds of years. And they've been paying for people to do this. So they'll pay a generator and say, I need extra power, put it on for me. I need less power, switch it off. Or I pay an industrial customer and I say, put more power on, or use more power, or use less. So that's what we're doing, right? And it's the basics of it. Now, so I look at a negative price and I say, it's just a price signal. That's all it is, okay? Now, what's the price signal actually telling us? That's the important thing. Well, what it's a little bit crazy about it is what you're actually doing is you're actually saying to a user, take power. In other words, I'll pay you money to take power, or you're telling producers, switch off power. Now, we have to look at why this happens and what's different about now over the last 100 years. Well, the difference is really we've got too much solar and wind at certain times in the system. And it's right across the continent because the continent is interconnected. Means Germany passes its problems onto its neighbors, right? Simple as that, all right? And vice versa. So we look at the exact reasons. The first one is it is impossible to reduce or switch off certain types of generation. First and foremost, if you can imagine, if you've got a large hydro plant, it's full. Well, what can you do? You can't just switch it off, because if you do that, you're going to cause floods, etc., etc. Run of the river hydro, same thing. Water's running down. You don't have a dam capabilities. You have to let the water through. And also the other thing is small scale solar installation. 90% of the solar installations that are in people's homes across Europe we're not able to control them in any way, right? Plus they've no incentive to do it, etc., etc. That's the first type. Second thing is we've got a whole pile of subsidy mechanisms, and I call this the drug of the industry for the last 15 years, which is called a feed-in tariff, or a CFD. And the drug of it is the fact that whatever you produce, you just put it into the system. And you've been given priority access to the system, which means that everybody else has to react when there's too much power in the system, right? But by the way, it's not just that. It's also green certificates. Because if you're a big hydro producer and you sort of be saying, well, I should be cutting my power now, what you're actually not doing is you're not doing it because of the fact that actually you're getting money in addition to your power generation fee. You're getting that through the green certificate. So basically, you're incentivizing people to actually go into negative prices until you reach the value of that premium. The other thing is, we heard it a little bit from the two speakers earlier on, it's really expensive to switch off certain types of power. In particular, when we got new nuclear up in Finland, and you look at it, you go, do you really make the decision just to switch off for a few hours, or what do you do? So that's, and basically you've got a lot of inflexible generation in it. And the other thing is that you've also got a whole pile of electricity generation that is not where electricity, in other words, power market revenues, is not the only form of revenue. And in particular, I would say if you've got a CHP, you're providing industrial heat to somebody, power, it's an excess thing. So what do you do with it? You don't really care, you just throw it in the system. And then, of course, the other thing is that there's some power plants that are just set up to provide services to the grid, right? So these are the real reasons why, just to be clear, why we end up with this situation where we end up with negative prices. What I find interesting about this is, sorry, if I can go back, one sec here, I'm using a Mac, which doesn't like this. But if you look, this shouldn't be new to everybody. And the reason it shouldn't be new is because we've had a whole pile of academic studies over the last decade that are saying, hey, listen, if we want to decarbonize, we're going to have a situation where intermittent renewables is going to be much bigger than peak demand. That's what we've been hearing from everyone. And in particular, the case of Germany, what you have is, if you look at the Fraunhofer studies, they're saying really that we'll have double the renewable capacity in 2030 than what we have peak demand. Well, that tells you, what are you going to do when you've got peak demand, when you've got that excess supply? It has to go somewhere, right? So you curtail it, you do something with it. So what's for me is the most shocking thing about all it is that there's so many parties that are not prepared for this. And it starts with the grid operators. This is the Dutch grid. If you want to build a hospital there or get a connection in a new home, you can't. All right. So in other words, there is not the capacity in the grid to actually do anything. And it's not just the Netherlands. It's also actually gone into regions in Germany. And you can imagine, as it goes on, as we go and renewablize more, you put more solar at homes, you put more EV chargers in, this is only going to get worse. It's not going to get better, right? The second point I would say is that, again, so may I ask somebody else just to control this, because my Mac doesn't really like doing this. If you could go to number 2. Yeah. So what I would, that's great. That's brilliant. Yeah. What I would just say is the regulators have been sleeping, and they've not pushed changes in how the grid works. And so what we look at is the historical grid is just used for throwing power from outside a city to in a city, big generation in. Now we've got power flows going in different directions. And actually what you've got is grid operators completely blind to what's going on. So the grid operator has actually no idea what's going on in my home. And I could be doing whatever in terms of self-generation. They haven't a clue. They can't see it, right? And so they don't have the visibility in this, which makes decision-making really, really difficult. And again, I'm going to just say regulators have not been on top of this, and they have been sleeping. Could you go to the next slide there, please? Sorry. The other thing is equipment manufacturers are not prepared. If you want to go and get a transformer today, it's anywhere from 9 months to 4 years. And that's in Europe. So we're actually very lucky. If you're in the United States and you want to get a high voltage transformer, it could take you 5 years, right? So the equipment manufacturers haven't even been prepared to it. Could you go to the next slide? And I would also say now what's now happening is that the renewable developers are becoming concerned. Why would I build more renewables when prices are already zero on sunny day? This is just a day in Spain, June the 24th. Why would I build solar in that system? You might say it's got the lowest levelized cost of energy, but actually what does that bring me if I get zero on a sunny day in Spain? It doesn't bring me anything. And you might say, well, don't worry about that. You've got CFDs and you've got this, that, and the other thing. Actually, no, I'm a finance guy. So I look at this from a risk perspective and I go, I don't think you should be building solar in Spain anymore, right? So next slide. And what I also say then, as at the back of this, what we've got is EU, we've got all these different governments across Europe who are sort of saying, well, we need to build out renewables. Okay, so show me the incentives to enable this to happen going forward, because it's not going to be just merchant and PPAs, because somebody has to take all this risk in and around, hey, I sell power to you, and either I can't deliver the power to you, or guess what? I've got zero price in the market. And then if I was Microsoft on the other side, why would I buy that power from you at 50 when I can get in the power market at zero, right? So you've got all these difficulties in the market that make it from a financing of future renewables difficult. Next slide, please. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about was what actually the future of decarbonization in Europe is. And I'll explain why this is very important. It's all about decarbonizing buildings. And buildings is everything from the residential home to heavy industry. That's what it's about. It is not about building large-scale wind or solar, offshore, onshore, etc. It's about how do we decarbonize buildings. Next slide. And I would just like to give you an idea is if you actually look, what you're already seeing is solar and lithium-ion batteries are making our homes into power plants. Right? We're seeing a huge move towards behind the meter generation And also, I would also say in the few companies, we're going to see behind the transformer. You're going to see private wires. You have data center companies saying, hey, I need to actually go and have private wires here. Now, I just want to give a very example of this, and just to give you and really put it into practical terms. If you go and do solar in Germany today, installation rooftop is about €1.50 a watt. That's about €90 a megawatt hour, to put it into perspective. Okay, if I do balcony solar, it's at 40 cents. What that means is I can put solar in my garden and I'm at €30 a megawatt hour. I'm at 3 cents a kilowatt hour and the power price is 30. Why that's, and why am I making this as a point to you? You're all thinking in front of the meter. And actually your big cannibalization, I think, going forward is going to be behind the meter. Because from the customer perspective, it makes sense to do this. And so just to give you an idea of what balcony solar is, it's plug and play solar. I don't need an electrician. I basically, there's a wire that comes out of these two panels and I plug it into the local mains and it's done. The grid operator hasn't a clue what's going on, okay? Now, next slide, please. Let me just give you an example of how extreme this is. This is Pakistan, and I looked on Pakistan's government site this morning, and officially at the end of 2023, they had 1.1 gigawatt of solar in a market which is about sort of 45 gigawatts, right? Now, if you go and look at the picture on the right this morning, which I took this morning, what this shows is that every second rooftop in this town is solar. They've solar on the roofs. And the bottom line is today, is actually what they say is that the Pakistan commercial and residential market, they will have about 20 gigawatts worth of solar installed on the system, unrecorded, not talked to the grid, no subsidies in place by the end of this year. What that suddenly means is that country's gone from 0%, basically 0% power generation from solar to 10% in a year and a half. And they've all done this because of economics. And they're not using balcony solar, by the way. So you can imagine where I'm coming from, right? So the point I'm making is the real threat you have to think about is behind the meter. And if I'm behind the meter, the other thing that behind the meter allows me to do is I can also use the assets in front of the meter. If you're in front of the meter, you can't use it behind. You can't use it behind the meter. So it's actually from a financing perspective less risky. Could you go to the next slide, please? So let me just go and just give you a view of what this means going forward and where we're going from. The first solution to all of this is you enable batteries in the power system. And I say enable because you have to provide the regulatory environments to allow this to happen. There are still countries in Europe which basically don't allow batteries in the system. There are countries that do not allow behind the meter batteries to actually be used in the power system, right? We need to speed up battery out permissions, etc., etc. And I guess to give you an idea, this is California, and this is just to give you an idea. Yellow is solar, and they talk about the duck curve, as they call it. The duck curve is now gone. The reason is because the green is batteries. So what actually you see is when the sun goes in, the biggest form of generation is batteries. And it used to be for an hour. I just want to say it's going to get longer and longer and longer. 3 hours, 6 hours, 9, and it will go that way because I just put in a 3-hour battery, and then I can put a 3-hour battery beside that as well, another one beside that. So you can see very quickly I can get to that curve being flattened out completely because of the fact that you've got low cost storage in the system. So that's the first point. Second point, we need to enable distributed energy resources. And what I mean by that is we have to flexibilize demand. I'm living in Germany today. I have no flexible tariff. And even if I did, why would I do it? Because, you know, the 30 cents that I pay, actually 5 cents of that is power generation. The rest is grid costs and. So you have to go and flexibilize that to really incentivize me to go and move my demand to a Sunday afternoon when there's lots of sun. Okay, so there's really significant regulatory changes that are needed here. And I would also add into this EVs. I've got a 10 kilowatt hour battery in there, and I've got a 100 kilowatt hour battery out there. Okay, so connect me into that 100 kilowatt hour battery and connect it into the system and connect it into the home, right? So that's enabling distributed energy, but it requires, again, regulatory change because there's blocks in the system everywhere. Third point, if you could just move on, sorry. The third point is increased grid expenditure. What you're seeing is you've got massive increase in expenditure in renewables, North America and Europe. And what you've got is for every $1 is going into renewables, you're getting about 40 cents that is going into grid. It needs to be at about 90. So we have to increase grid expenditure. And I'm not saying it's just about building wires. You also have to build intelligence in the system, et cetera, but we have to increase grid expenditure. This is if you build more interconnectors, then guess what you do? You can move the power to other places, right? Next slide, please. The other thing is engage with data center companies. They can provide massive flexibility and they can become the next generation VPPs. This is just what's going on in Texas right now. And Texas has a program with the data center companies. And what they do is, you can see this, what they're able to do is ramp up and down by 1.5 gigawatts a day, their demand, just based on the data centers, putting a special program in place for them. Now, if we don't do this, it's going to be incredibly stressed in the system, right? Because these data centers, all of them, AI ones, are at least 500 megawatts inside. That's what they talk. They don't talk about the computing power. They talk about how much power they use, right? And that's critical. Next one is enable energy intelligence. I mean, I'm sorry to say that the system that we have in place, it's got more intelligent in the last years, but again, the grid operators, there's too many people in the system blind to what's going on. And the only way we can change things is really to invest more in power electronics, okay, improve software, invest in AI tree, trust in AI tree, make sure that you're connecting devices together, that you see things. If you do this, you save money, you improve efficiency, and you reduce costs. And then, next slide, please. And finally, this is Einstein. And because I was thinking, how do you end this? This is a difficult moment, right? This is complex. In the middle of every difficulty lies opportunity. And that's the last words I will say for this. Thank you.
All right, Gerard, what a lot of valuable information and insights and vision in your presentation as well, like the other speakers. A bit flabbergasted, although not everything is new, but we saw it coming, as you said. You mentioned one interesting thing is like, we have to basically rebuild the system. The system we have right now is not equipped for the massive build out of renewables, right? So we have to rebuild the system, and we have to do it faster, as we are doing today, because of the challenges we have with the climate change. So actually, in order to speed this up, we maybe we must inject more subsidies to speed up the installation of storage, maybe even long duration storage, to solve this issue, right? Is it? But you said let's get rid of the subsidies. Are you still there? No, Gerard didn't hear it. Maybe the other speakers, Jean-Paul or Sylvain, are you still there? Can you answer the question?
You reconnected.
Yeah.
Oh, Gerard is there again. Gerard, did you hear my question?
I'm sorry. I was trying to get rid of the presentation and I pressed leave. Sorry, so I didn't hear your question.
Good, you're back. But so the question was, you said like we should get rid of the subsidies, right? It's kind of a drug. But on the other side, we need to speed up the energy transition. So maybe we need more subsidies to speed up this transition. Subsidies, for instance, to put more storage in that system. How would you look at that?
The way I would look at it is, the drugs have got us to where we are now. But we really have to radically think how we do it going forward, because what we will do is I would say we're going to put our industry at such competitive disadvantage going forward if we do this wrong. So I think we really have to take a step back and think about how we go and take the next steps going forward. And I give you a very simple example. You've got maybe, I'd say, 1/3 of countries in Europe where we want to decarbonize heat. Well, it makes no sense to decarbonize heat if you're paying 30 cents for electricity and 10 cents for gas. Makes no sense, right? So we have to go and see about how do you balance that. But making electricity more expensive by subsidizing it is not going to help us actually decarbonize the system, because decarbonization means we have to electrify.
Okay, one more question for you, Gerard, before we go to the other ones. So this is a question from Berto Martins. Nice to see you, Berto. You're also joining in this show. Investment in the grids is key, Gerard. But when we speak about interconnections, the topic about who pays for the investment and also more local approaches are killing the investments. How do you consider this issue?
You're absolutely right. So nobody wants to have interconnector near them. People don't like them digging up roads, putting cables in, etc., etc. So it does require us to think about things in a different way. So think about things in different ways. One is you're going to have to put cables underground as much as possible, right? So that you might disturb the farmer for a few months, but then it's underground and it's out of the way. And you also do them underwater. And the second thing, and I think it's even much more important, is we have to change the way the grid is managed. I mean, the fact about it is, if you ask a grid operator in a distribution grid at any time, one moment in time, you've probably got about 20% capacity utilization. So that means 80% of the time is not being used. That's not acceptable in this world. So that requires a rethinking of how the grid is managed. And people are not doing that because a grid operator has an incentive, which is to put more assets in the ground, because that's how he gets paid, right?
All right. Next
So
question.
I'm being radical in what I'm saying here, but if you want to decarbonize, you have to rethink at this point in time the incentive structures that we have in place, because they're not working.
All right. Thanks, Gerard. Then question for Jean-Paul from Leendert Flores. Hello, Leendert. Good to see you here as well. Jean-Paul, you seem to be negative about subsidies as well. How do you look at the 24 gigawatt of solar in the Netherlands in that light?
Yeah, so the 24 gigawatts of solar in the Netherlands is actually a result of a distorting regulation promoting the installation of solar behind the meter. And so you could net off your solar production in the summer versus consumption in the winter, which was a good way of building up a certain amount of solar capacity. But of course, it completely backfired now, and we're seeing such massive excess generation that is non-dispatchable because it's behind the meter. That is basically ruining the revenue for large-scale solar. I think.
So you would say we should stop subsidizing solar in the Netherlands.
I think any subsidy in principle is good to get things started, but you have to have an exit plan, because otherwise you keep subsidizing something that might not be the most efficient solution anymore. And what I see is that subsidies do have a tendency to block innovation and adaptations of the market to new circumstances. One of the reasons behind, for example, very low amounts of domestic energy storage in the Netherlands is because you don't need storage if you can net off your generation versus your consumption over the whole year. So why would you put a battery in between? Doesn't make any sense to make that investment. If we couldn't have done that, we might have had a similar domestic battery penetration as the Germans have.
Yeah, and so, but if you think about it, if we would stop subsidies in the Netherlands, that will slow down the market for a while, maybe. Well, some solar companies will go out of business because they were not prepared for this. So it will, lead to a shakeout and this disruption in the market in a way. But we have to go through that phase in order to build up again. Is that what you're saying?
I think you could, but I mean, if you're building something that doesn't make any money, why would you be building it?
No. Okay. Sylvain or Gerard, any comments on that?
Well, rooftop solar does not need subsidies in the Netherlands. Okay, it's in the money. That's the reality. And I go exactly to what you said, John Paul. If what you should have done is not allowed the incentive to actually basically do net metering, because otherwise then what would have happened is you would have got batteries automatically coming in because they make economic sense. Batteries, solar in the money across Europe when you've got high retail power prices. Simple as that. So let the market do what it does.
Good. I have a question, Sylvain. Obviously, I don't see any slowdown or any market saying, "Hey, we're going to stop for a while with solar." Definitely not in Spain. I don't see that right now. But and at the same time, we have this interconnectivity happening and the massive build-out plans from all the TSOs in Europe. So what does that mean? What is that going to mean for the electricity price if we continue just the way we are doing?
Well, a couple of points here and agree. I mean, what's interesting actually to follow is that when we look at some of the national energy and climate plans, and Gerald was presenting some analysis, interesting to see that when you look at them, you've got the impression that all of the countries in Europe want to export clean electricity. So it doesn't work in the end. You just don't look at the demand side of the equation. And this is, I think, where it's important. Gerard and Jean-Paul really hinted at it. There are really a lot of aspects, but demand side needs to be looked at in detail. And currently in Europe, it's difficult because where demand is not out of the crisis yet, demand remains depressed. There's really a big question of when demand will rebound, how it will rebound. Is it going to be driven by electrolysis, even though we see a lot of delays to projects and cancellations? Is it going to be other sources of electrification, like heat pumps, electric vehicles? But the thing is, you can't have a supply trajectory which is disconnected from the demand trajectory. And I guess this is going to be critical. And just really to highlight some of what Jean-Paul and Gerard said, we talked about negative pricing curtailment. We thought about market forces. But really, it's the interplay between regulation and market forces, which is really difficult. Because as mentioned by Gerard, regulators, I mean, some of that stuff's been done for 10 years, but it's just that we just haven't reacted. We haven't put in place the right regulation policy. A number of negative prices are just driven by regulation itself, actually, that provides the wrong incentives. And this is something where we see we need to have subsidies, perhaps. Our analysis says we need to have subsidies to reach the 2030 targets, but we need to have smaller subsidies. And this is also what's important.
Can I, Edwin, can I just add one small thing? I know this has come back to Pakistan, but just to give you an idea of the extreme of their problem next year. If they add on another 10 gigawatts of power next year, and let's assume they have 30 gigawatts of solar by next year, it's uncontrollable by the grid operator. Okay, now what that actually means is, let's assume it's a Sunday and everyone's just, fast asleep and it's a big sunny day, and power demand is 25 gigawatts, then they have a blackout. Yeah. Okay, because it's uncontrollable, and that's a serious issue. And by the way, we're near that in certain countries in Europe. We are near that, and that where if something like that happens in a German environment where you've also got a whole pile of uncontrollable solar, the same thing. What the hell do you do in the system? Is the system prepared for it? So it's not just an economic issue. It really is a resilience issue in the system. And I really do believe the regulators have just been completely asleep to this. And don't realize the speed of change that's going on around us, right?
I wanted to add, actually, I had a question on my mind when you were starting this new Pakistan the example, but because I think we had a discussion earlier on, and you said, it's uncontrollable. So there will be more Germans installing solar because they just like it, even if they don't make the numbers, financial numbers, because for environmental reasons, they will keep on installing. Then you have the balcony solar, which is kind of a giveaway, so cheap. And then on top of that, we see battery prices dropping drastically in the coming years. So people will also install home batteries. And then maybe in a few years, we have the vehicle to grid, also behind the meter. All of that uncontrollable. So the thing gets worse even further than just the extension of the solar build-up, right?
But that's the bad news. But the good news, you can all use these other resources. They can all be used as resources and part of the solution. But it requires regulatory change, and it requires changes in standards. It also might mean retrofitting of some of the solutions that are out there. But this needs to happen, in my opinion, because again, it's you could get yourself into an extreme situation. And again, it's just the economics of solar makes so much sense, also in Northern Europe, right?
All right. I would like to thank all of the speakers because we finished. We're in 1 hour. We can continue, but the good news is we're going to continue on this discussion on the 27th of November in Amsterdam with these experts and many more experts on different areas from the gas market, from nuclear, all the elements, the storage market. We will put all these experts on stage and discuss further on what the future is going to look like for the electricity price. So the discount code is here available, and all the questions. Thank you for bringing in these questions. We will forward them to the speakers. Maybe they have time to answer some of them for you. Otherwise, I would kindly invite you to join our event in Amsterdam, where we have more extensive discussions about this. Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much, Sylvain. Thank you very much, Gerard. And thank you all in the audience for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.